From the oracles of the deep past to the modern realm of the psychic spy, governments and intelligence agencies have used remote viewing to answer the unanswerable, a specialized technique to secretively gain information on anything. It's up to us as individuals to take our power back, to know the truth, to become our own psychic spies. A thrust of the plates, a rush of water, a pyroclastic flow. Civilizations that once were, now memories lost to time. You can't control the past, only the words that reference it. I'm John Vivanco, and welcome to the archives. But you know, sometimes stories and evidence of lost civilizations, they poke their heads up through our history. You know, if they fall within a certain historical time frame, and they have the characteristics of being a lesser evolved culture than our current, then we're good. We're told that we can accept it as being something physically real. But there's this cutoff point where these stories automatically fall into the realm of mythology if they get too deep into the past of human history on Earth. We're told it could not have existed because our physical and cultural evolution make it impossible for something like this to exist. So it's relegated to mythology. And the narrative is that we basically evolved from mud. We move through this progression ever upward, reaching for a pinnacle of scientific and spiritual understanding, and we're always at that pinnacle pushing forward. All that's below and in the past could never be more than what we are now. And there can be no greater civilization on Earth than the one we have right now. So this is both true and not true, in my opinion. From my perspective, it's only true from the standpoint of a great reset here on Earth, a change in the ages where massive cataclysms occurred and the human race developed from that standpoint, forgetting about the past. And this is a cyclical thing where humans, or even different renditions of humans, develop, then civilization is met with a great destruction, things get wiped out and lost to history, and we're forced to start over, either locally or globally. In many remote viewing projects we've done, we see that the past civilizations on Earth follow a grand cycle that many cultures have spoken of. The Greeks, the Hindus, the Mesoamericans, the Egyptians, Christians, and many others, they have this grand cycle of ages where there's this de-evolution, gradual de-evolution of humans through the ages. It's a disconnection from divinity. And then as the ages progress, it gradually comes back. The Hindus call it the Yugas, and the Greeks call it the ages. And humans cycle through the ages over and over. One whole cycle through all the ages takes around 24,000 years or so. And in between these turning of ages, there are great cataclysms where the past age and its accomplishments are destroyed, buried under the sea, or destroyed by volcanism and other planetary disasters. They're mostly lost to time and memory. But there are these little edges that poke up through our history, whether they're stories or physical aspects of ancient structures that defy current understanding. From the Giza Plateau, for instance, where there are drill holes and cuts in the stone that exhibit a technology that we don't have now. The cut marks, when analyzed by engineers, exhibit a tool that cuts at a rate and a frequency which is beyond any tool that we have today. And that's just scratching the surface of the questions surrounding the pyramids. There's a ton more anomalies with them that don't fit. Now in Mesoamerica, it's the same thing, where interlocking stacked blocks that weigh many tons are said to have been created by primitive peoples using chisels and hammers. There are many sites, out-of-place artifacts across the whole world that defy our current explanation of how humans evolved. For all these types of locations, mainstream needs to fit it within a specific conceptual idea that if we cannot create this now, or it's nearly impossible to create, then it's ignored. This is institutionalized as well through John Wesley Powell, the second director of the USGS and first director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution back in the late 1800s. Richard Dewhurst, the author of The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, pointed out in his book the decree that Powell laid out in a paper while he was the director. It stated, "Hence it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historic purposes, and that no anthropological research should consider any talk of lost tribes henceforth." Well, what does this mean? Well, it means that if you want any legitimacy, research funding, or a career in anthropology, archaeology, or another related field, you better ignore everything that does not fit into this model of human evolution and time. So if you, an anthropologist, spoke of Egyptian hieroglyphs or artifacts in the US, or giant bones, or for that matter, evidence of advanced technology at any megalithic site across the US or the world, you're going to lose your livelihood. And this is the model that the Smithsonian and institutions across the world have gone by, and they still exhibit this behavior today. The big issue for that model now, though, is that there is a veritable industry of research and tourism to these locations because of the sheer number of them. But these aspects, well, they're ignored by mainstream and governments, or ridiculed, because it's become policy even in the face of overwhelming evidence and questions. And this reminds me of the UFO phenomena, where in the 1960s, the Brookings Report was used to craft government policy when it came to potential alien life being disclosed to the public. Their recommendation was to not reveal alien life because the average person would not be able to handle it. You know, they'll freak out, they'll go rock in the corner, they won't go to work anymore, and the government will lose control. So this, because of that, became policy as well, even in the face of evidence to the contrary in the general public. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, one of the westernmost inhabited islands, lies a curious feature under 85 feet of water that's been referred to as Japan's Atlantis, the Yonaguni Monument. This is a popular diving destination during the winter months because, people want to swim with hammerhead sharks. So in 1985, Kihachiro Aratake, a local dive tour operator, went on a dive and noticed this formation dramatically jutting out from the ocean floor as he was exploring the area. He surveyed it, circling a couple times around it, taking photographs, and marveling at the carved out pathways and stairs and star-shaped platform and pillars, as well as this overall pyramidal or tapered shape. Eventually, scientists from the Ryukyu University made their way to investigate the site, and depending on who it was, they were either in the camp of natural or artificial. Now, the natural camp claims that because of the earthquake-prone area, these are naturally created parallel fractures in the rock, and there's nothing to see here. So looking at this with remote viewing, we wanted to know, how did the site form? Is this a natural geological process or something manipulated and artificial, or perhaps, a bit of both? Remote viewing data would go into a formation process, natural formation process of the land, moving with earthquakes and whatnot. And artificial would be, pretty obvious on the side of human involvement, either constructing or manipulating what's there than, what they used it for. The data describes large stone slabs sitting underwater that were formed through a natural process over a long period of time. So we have this natural element showing up first, but then the data starts to describe that they were manipulated, added to, and subtracted to create a ziggurat type structure when the area was above water by humans. The viewers describe this human involvement in the manipulation of something that is natural. Now, if you want to know how the mainstream world classifies and engineers thought about these types of things, all you need to do is head over to Wikipedia, where you're going to get your daily dose of what's socially accepted when it comes to these things. The geologist Robert Schoch out of Boston University is used as the main scientist in Wikipedia and other avenues to discount the artificial side of this feature. So he had investigated the site many times and came to the conclusion that this was a naturally formed feature, okay? Just like our data. This is what's focused upon within the natural camps to prove that there's nothing there. But what is left out is that he also had said we should also consider the possibility that the Yonaguni Monument is fundamentally a natural structure that was utilized, enhanced, and modified by humans in ancient times. The reason he stated this is because there's evidence of manipulation of these natural features. But it's completely ignored so that the Powell doctrine stays intact. And this is how it's done. Take what you want to hear, fit it to your narrative, make your case, then discard the rest. Our data clearly describes exactly what he stated. Natural, that was manipulated. Now the structure in the data is described as being manipulated by humans this way because there's a large amount of earth energies flowing through the area. Now, this is a normal thing with the more ancient cultures in that they would seek out these locations where there was a convergence of energies that they could utilize for practical and spiritual purposes. In the case of this site, it was somewhat of a ritual site and a school. This is described as a place where there was a type of mystery school where people would come to understand aspects of astral travel, how to do it, and leaving the body. As well, there was indication of the data of being able to communicate with those outside the Earth realm and in other locations across the galaxy. The layout is in the form of sacred geometry, where there are interlocking shapes that are embedded within the manipulation of the natural formation. To me, it's based off of many projects on these types of structures. This is one that comes from a different age, a pre-flood age, 10,000 years ago or more. In fact, in the remote viewing data, it was said that this city submerged because ice at the poles melted and let go. That was 10,000 years ago. Now, this structure is also much larger than what we can actually currently see. Because of the buildup of the sediment, the base is completely covered. Now, if it were uncovered, more would be found, specifically entryways into the interior of the monument. And there you'd find relics, carvings, and statues, along with areas for ritual in these dark carved out rooms placed within specific areas of the sacred geometrical construction. Carvings and statues, well, they depict stories and instructions on traveling and how to travel. You actually find this within temples in India. Now, each temple, different than the next, conveys information on what it was about and instructions related to it. It just needs to be decoded. Praveen Mohan on YouTube does an excellent job going to some of these temples to decode what they're about, so I recommend you check out his channel. Now, this temple and school complex in Yonaguni somewhat mirrors this idea, albeit without the Hindu iconography. And this culture who built Yonaguni also seemed to be a society that utilized even telepathy to communicate. And we've seen this aspect when looking at the pyramids of Giza as well. This idea of communication through the use of these sacred geometrical constructions to enhance it and communicate with those on Earth, the solar system, and outside of it. To me, in what I've seen, this location is or was part of a vast culture on this Earth in a previous age. A culture that we've seen utilize technologies that appear esoteric to us today, now littered across the ocean floor and buried by time. From what I understand, after the find of this site in 1985, other sites and anomalies were searched for and have been found from this island all the way to Taiwan. Now, this site is also reminiscent of the Baltic Sea anomaly, at least from the context of remote viewing. That feature was found in 2011 by Ocean X, who are treasure hunters that were scanning the seafloor with sonar in that area. The sonar produced an image that was reminiscent of a UFO or the Millennium Falcon, your choice there. And this gave rise to the theories about it being a spaceship dumped at the bottom of the ocean in some long ago age. Now, one of the claims was that when they were over the site, it affected electricity and satellite phones that they were using, causing things to become inoperable. So we looked at this a number of times, with many different remote viewers over time, and it always comes back as the same thing. Not a UFO, but an area that formed there naturally, predominantly glacial deposits from long ago, and then humans came in to sculpt it into a place to live, to have ceremonies and ritual, and to learn. And interestingly, in the data on these sites, there's typically a very intense electromagnetic energy. It's based on Earth energies, and it's enhancing the area because of the sacred geometry built into the structures. They always go hand in hand, so it's not surprising that those researching current day would run into issues with electricity and electronics there. Now, this site is far away from Yonaguni, but it's the same narrative on taking a natural feature and sculpting it into what they wanted it to be. Then, melting ice covers up what once was. Sea levels rise. So this is definitely a theme when it comes to lost civilizations. Some, though, they don't really amount to anything. Not everything is something, like this feature in the Bahamas near the Bermuda Triangle. So this was found by Secure Team 10, a YouTube channel that deals in alien, UFO, and conspiracy issues. And they were scouring Google Earth when they came across these like pyramids sticking out of the ocean floor. So we had a look, and it was just a normal geologic process that created uplift right there. So not everything is something. The location of Atlantis is one of those revolving things, and certain times it becomes trendy to place it in certain locations. And it's been placed in the Mediterranean, in the Bahamas, Atlantic Ocean, Africa, South America, Antarctica. It goes on and on. You know, it's an interesting thing to me that the majority get focused on whether Atlantis existed or not when there are many other sites that we physically actually know of. And when something new is found, everyone claims it's Atlantis. Look, we found Atlantis again. Now, it's because the story of Atlantis fascinates us to no end. It's this idea of a utopian society that's highly advanced with mermaids and mythical creatures. It's a prime subject for films and TV shows. Now, the origination point of the story of Atlantis comes out of two dialogues from Plato around 3360 BC called the Timaeus and the Critias. Plato used allegories in his writing to illustrate situations that could be learned from. Now, in the case of these writings, many consider them to be allegories and not something real. He uses Atlantis to demonstrate a story about a highly advanced culture that became corrupted. They took over other nation states and ignored rule of law. For this, the Atlanteans were punished by the gods and their island destroyed. Now, originally, Plato hears of the story of Atlantis from an Athenian statesman named Solon. So Solon heard of this story from an Egyptian priest while he was in Egypt. The Egyptians, they held so much oral knowledge about civilizations and cataclysms, and at that time, they were pretty much considered to be the ones you would go to if you wanted to know about the deep history on Earth. So irregardless of whether anyone today believes that there was an Atlantis or not, the interesting thing here is that this information originally came from a culture that held deep historical knowledge like this. Atlantis was described as a lush island with a central high mountain peak that turned into plains and stretched to the ocean. The plains were used for farming, where they had 2 growing seasons because of the temperate and lush climate. Now, around the central city, there were concentric rings of water and land as somewhat of a fortification, but also where people lived. There were hot and cold springs on the island and constructed waterways to funnel this water where they needed it. In the center of the city was the great temple of Poseidon, which was adorned with gold, silver, and ivory. The society was considered wealthy and abundant, a utopian society of peace and prosperity, as well as a military might that dwarfed those around them. Now, just a quick caveat here on how remote viewing data works. Remote viewers don't name things. They describe things at a basic level. To name something during a remote viewing session is an abstracting process from low-level information into an idea about that thing, right? So it's turning low-level sensory information into a higher-level concept to contain it all. For instance, if a remote viewer is describing something at a low level and they're using words like old, ancient, rocks lined up and stacked like a wall, brown, heavy, etc., and then from that low level information they deduce Atlantis, we discount that. And these higher level concepts derived from low level information are most often wrong. So when remote viewers do go into higher level concepts about low level information, a better way to look at these things is it is like the idea of Atlantis rather than it being Atlantis, right? So an ancient civilization. So in remote viewing these things, we would likely not know that we are looking at the actual Atlantis. So we're going to look at two locations that are contenders for Atlantis, one on land and one in the ocean. Now, there are many more locations, but we're just going to take a look at these for now. The Rechat structure, or Eye of Sahara, is a massive geological feature in the vast and lonely Sahara Desert. It's known to Bedouins and locals for centuries, but it wasn't until the 1960s that this was spotted and spoken of in the Western world by the Gemini astronauts because they would fly over it and use it as a navigation aid. The ring has a diameter of 25 miles and is composed of a variety of volcanic rocks in the ring shapes. Some people believe that this could be a potential location for Atlantis. You've got the ring structure, and 10,000 years ago and earlier, there's probably a bit more lush there. But that's it for the things that line up. Nothing else really physically lines up with the descriptions coming from Plato. Irregardless, we had a look at a couple things around it because a lot of people are talking about it potentially being Atlantis. And one of those things is how it was created, whether that is natural or artificial. So in that data, we have a volcanic and erosive process over a very long period of time. There did not appear to be any ejection of material, more so it was just pushing the surface up from the underground. And then you had rain, wind, and weather further sculpting it over the centuries. So definitely natural in origin, and our data lines up with what geologists have described about this structure. But now that does not mean that there was never a civilization there. It's possible that the concentric circles had waterways through them and the people constructed homes in the high points of the rings at one point. So now, the task becomes to describe any large civilization that was ever there, if it ever existed. It's a bit of an open search with remote viewing, but it still works. And one of the predominant themes in the data was that there was a description of slavery and mining. Now, this is something that has gone on for a long time there as well, this slavery and mining, where slaves have been used to mine whatever minerals and rocks some government or warlord deemed of value at the time. The data also describes small relics, pottery shards, weapons, and junk or trash in the ground. There was nothing in the way of structures or anything related to a civilization being there that showed in the data. Rather, humans used the location where they came and went over the ages. The Cyclades are a group of 220 islands that sit to the east of Greece and the west of Turkey in the Mediterranean Sea. The most famous of the islands is Santorini, the remnant of a caldera which produced the largest volcanic eruption ever recorded. It's been thought that the eruption was the cause of the collapse of the Minoan civilization on Crete. It not only blanketed the whole area with ash, it also created a very large and destructive tsunami. And this occurred around 3,600 years ago, but we're going much further back than that. Back to a time when the Cyclades plateau was sitting above water around 10,000 years ago, which would have covered an area of around 4,000 square miles. Now, there have been many researchers speculating on this location as being where Atlantis was because of the fact that the land had become inundated with water just after the last ice age around 9,000 years ago, which lines up with the story coming from Plato because Solon had said that it was 10,000 years ago when it sunk under the ocean. Not to mention that there have been found figurines and remnants of a mysterious civilization on the land still above water. Many also think that the original story coming from Egypt had to do with a more local civilization and event because of the context in which Solon was told the story. The Egyptian priest telling it was relating history connected to Greece because he chided Solon on the Greeks' lack of historical knowledge in their region. Ruins and relics have been found on the existing islands, specifically stylized figurines, but what is underwater? So, looking with remote viewing, the viewers describe these slab-like structures, large blocks stacked, configured into the shapes of buildings that are in ruins, covered in silt and mud deep under the water, not visible. There are remnants of statues, pottery shards, and very large configurations that are stepped, dome-like, or arches and pyramidal. Also described along with all of that is it's an energy that seems to be pulsing from the area and is associated with a kind of sacred geometry. Once again, this is in the form of structures, much like what we saw with the Yonaguni Monument. Now, the sacred geometry, folks, is something that we typically see, like always shows up. They were interested in amping up that energy in given areas for different purposes. It's like, think about this, the cavitation effect, if you've ever heard of it. The Russian entomologist Viktor Grebennikov discovered, or actually rediscovered it. Now, his big claim was that he had observed a type of beetle in Siberia taking off from a surface at full flight speed. He noticed that the chitin, or the underside of the hard protective layer that covers the wings when they're not in use, were covered with an indented geometric shapes. His claim was that he built a platform, and the underside is lined with these pieces of chitin from the beetles, and he was able to fly. So he claimed that it caused anti-gravity. Now, outside of that, he'd also investigated, patented a device that used the shape of beehives, which would produce an energy that would alleviate headaches and cause pharmaceuticals to be more effective. What he discovered was the power that shapes have. You can find Grebennikov's writings translated from Russian online, and you should also look into a great book by Dan Davidson called Shape Power, which will give you a lot more information on what various shapes can do. But this is something that's known in these ancient cultures, what shapes to use for specific effects, where to use them. Whether it was for healing, esoteric practices, or increasing culture and governmental power, or just power itself, or anti-gravity. Now, as far as the people here go, there seems to be a mix of different races, some more advanced spiritually than others, but sharing in the knowledge to move all forward. In fact, the overall cultural focus was toward more of a spiritual enlightenment. Now, one interesting aspect that's come up with this location are that some of the beings came across in the data that were blue in color, which is reminiscent of Hindu mythology. And this is actually going to take us to the underwater ruins of Dwarka in India in a bit. But is this the fabled Atlantis over here in the Cyclades? Possibly, but even if there was excavation here, unless you have a flashing marquee saying Atlantis, there would be no real verification. Dwarka is a city that sits on the western coast of India on the Arabian Sea, right next to the Gulf of Cambay. The current city on the coast is a major pilgrimage site for Hindus, being one of the 7 most ancient cities in India. This location is also related in the Bhagavad Purana as part of the ancient kingdom that Krishna ruled, as well as in the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, Arjuna, one of the principal characters, described Dwarka being overtaken by water. And in the Harivamsha, a prologue to the Mahabharata, Krishna had instructed Arjuna to evacuate the city. Now, this prologue also describes this city in very fine detail. So because of this and other references, people have been searching for this location underwater in that area. Now, in the 1960s, a discovery was made and underwater excavations began. And they found walls, pillars, stone anchors, pottery shards spread over a very large area. Then in 2001, the government funded a pollution study. And during that, at 25 miles from shore and 120 feet of water, an incredible discovery was made. 2 cities were found underwater. When excavating the underwater site just after, artifacts were found that were dated to around 9,000 years old. Now this find predates any ancient city ever found by 5,000 years. That in and of itself is a huge issue to how mainstream archaeology interprets how civilizations grew on this planet. Now the next big issue is that the Mahabharata and other ancient texts describe this as the ancient city that Krishna ruled. When the Mahabharata war finished, Krishna stated that the city will be flooded and destroyed, which it was. And these ancient texts are supposed to be myths, just like the floods that we've had across the earth at various points in the ages. You know, we call them flood myths to keep them out of reality. But you can see there are many cities that have been swallowed by the ocean across the planet. Flood myths aren't myths, they are flood facts. Some of the contention points here with mainstream are that the artifacts from the site are wood that were carbon dated, and the explanation is that this was an old forest that was here, or items were pushed in by the current from another area, and they're not related to this site at all. But we're talking about this location being, physically there are structures here, and we're talking about this location being under 120 feet of water, which would place it under a massive flood that likely came across the whole Earth, which would make it around 9,000 to 10,000 years old, flooding from the end of the last ice age. So the next contention point becomes the side scan sonar was basically broken and they were misrepresenting the data, and there's no city, nothing there at all. Now to date, since 2007, there have been no, at least public, excavations there. The government's not really interested. Of course, it's a difficult thing to do, underwater archaeological excavations, and costs a lot of money, but the bigger issue is the massive upset it would cause to point out these ancient texts are actually historical documents. We're in what's called the Kali Yuga right now, the darkest, most confused age because of the disconnection from divinity. From the Greeks, this is also called the Iron Age. These ancient Hindu texts, they come from the other ages, the previous ages. They are beyond the Kali Yuga, and in my opinion, from what I've seen with remote viewing, they are absolutely historical. So think about this, the further back in time we go with remote viewing, the more advanced we see these cultures as being, not just technologically, but also spiritually. The further back we go, the more we see alien interaction here. So this site, and getting back to blue beings that show up in data across these sites, well, what do you think that means? When we look at other locations across the universe, we often see blue beings that appear the same as what we see in Hindu mythology, especially related to the Vega star system. So across this planet, in an earlier age, could it be that these beings and others interacted in culture here, grew it, and perhaps they're the gods of the past? This is not a nationalistic thing either. This is not just India and their culture. This is across the planet because we see them in older European sites. So what was found at this site, and why did excavations seemingly stop back around 2007? The data relates a lot of gold, a lot of treasure that was found in the form of statues and other items, but that's not why they stopped excavating or hid it. More importantly, it relates that the deeper the excavations go, the more contradictions there will be to the current narrative that no advanced cultures existed here. Within the layers of the structures there, because there are earlier sites underneath what's on top, a more advanced technology was used in the construction. And there are references to, interestingly, weapons in the data that are like missiles. And that's very strange. I think this is a really interesting point. There's evidence of using advanced weaponry there, as well as a battle that occurred in the area, not with arrows and axes, but what appeared to be explosions. Some of the buildings would shown to be blown up. On top of all that, there would probably be little physically in the way to verify this, but the viewers often get that blue subject there, who is considered a master in this location at the time we viewed it, a very father-like figure who guides and rules the whole area. Krishna? Perhaps. I would not doubt it based on everything I've seen so far. Now, in looking at the reason for ceasing excavations, it really comes down to the fact that this would verify the ancient Hindu scripts as being historical. As well, it would confirm the idea of the ages that continually cycle here on Earth and give credence to the Yugas, which is a different model altogether of time than what propaganda is today. So this site, it's one to ignore in the mainstream, to keep it at a level of arguing early investigative data points. Now, Dwarka has a lot of historical documentation behind it, so attack that, right? It's been found. But hey, if we can only find Atlantis based off of a scant Socratic dialogue, then we can finally prove that there were advanced civilizations here. At a certain point, it doesn't matter whether Atlantis existed or not when you have all these other sites that begin to reflect what people think Atlantis was about. Even if the actual Atlantis was found, there's a massive idea train that will fight to keep the current time construct we are told on track, burying and ignoring evidence to keep it in the zone of arguing about it. Many of these ancient civilizations across the earth had and utilized a higher technology, lived with the gods, aliens, then got wiped out in planet-wide cataclysms according to our data. What is within ancient texts are called myths because they come from the previous ages, embedded between cataclysms. And I think they need to be revisited with a different mindset. I thank you for watching. Until next time.